Charles Darwin, Darwin, Evolution and Natural Selection. Key points. Charles Darwin was a British naturalist who proposed the theory of biological evolution by natural selection. Darwin defined evolution as descent with modification, the idea that species change over time, give rise to new species, and share a common ancestor. The mechanism that Darwin proposed for evolution is natural selection. Because resources are limited in nature, organisms with heritable traits that favor survival and reproduction will tend to leave more offspring than their peers, causing the traits to increase in frequency over generations. Natural selection causes populations to become adapted or increasingly well suited to the environments over time. Natural selection depends on the environment and requires existing heritable variation in a group. What is evolution? The basic idea of biological evolution is that populations and species of organisms change over time. Today, when we think of evolution, we're likely to link this idea with one specific person, the British naturalist Charles Darwin. In the 1850s, Darwin wrote an influential and controversial book called On the Origin of Species. In it, he proposed that species evolve, or as he put it, undergo descent with modification, and that all living things and trace the descent to a common ancestor. You can learn more about in the article what exactly is a species. Darwin also suggested a mechanism for evolution, natural selection, in which heritable traits that help organisms survive and reproduce become more common in population over time. We have an explanation of a species is a group of similar organisms that can interbred with each other to make healthy, fertile offspring. For instance, all humans belong to the same species. Homo sapiens, domestic dogs are also a species, Canis familiaris. So what does heritable mean? Heritable trait is one that's passed on from parents to children by way of genes. For instance, eye color is a heritable trait. It is determined by the genes you get from your mom and dad. You can substitute the phrase genetically determined for heritable in this article if that makes more sense to you. In this article, we'll take a closer look at Darwin's ideas. We'll trace how they emerged from his worldwide travels on the ship HMS Beagle, and we'll also walk through an example of how evolution by natural selection can work. Early ideas about evolution influences on Darwin. In the 18th century, James Hutton, a Scottish naturalist, proposed that geological change occurred gradually by the accumulation of small changes from processes operating like they are today over long periods of time. This contrasted with the predominant view that the geology of the planet was a consequence of catastrophic events occurring during a relatively brief past. Hutton's view was popularized in the 19th century by the geologist Charles Lyell, who became a friend of Darwin's. Lyell's ideas about gradual geological change would play an important role in shaping Darwin's thinking about gradual biological evolution. Thomas Malthus was another thinker who strongly influenced Darwin. Malthus was interested in the growth of human populations and wrote about factors that ultimately limited exponential human population growth, such as diseases and limited food. His ideas were crucial in Darwin's realization that most natural populations produced more offspring than their environment could support, such that only a fraction of the offspring could survive and reproduce. Darwin and the Voyage of Beagle. Darwin's seminal book On the Origin of the Species set forth his ideas about evolution and natural selection. These ideas were largely based on direct observations from Darwin's travels around the globe. From 1831 to 1836, he was part of a survey expedition carried out by the ship HMS Beagle, which included stops in South America, Australia, and the southern tip of Africa. At each of the expedition stops, Darwin had the opportunity to study and catalog the local plants and animals. Over the course of his travels, Darwin began to see intriguing important in the distribution and features of organisms. We can see some of the most important patterns Darwin noticed in distribution of organisms by looking at his observations of the Galapagos Islands off the coast of Ecuador. Darwin found that nearby islands in the Galapagos had similar but non-identical species of finches living on them. Moreover, he noted that each finch species was well suited for its environment and role. For instance, species that ate large seeds intend to have large, tough beaks, while those that ate insects and thin, sharp beaks. Finally, he observed that the finches and other animals found on the Galapagos Islands were similar to species on the nearby mainland of Ecuador, but different from those found elsewhere in the world. Darwin didn't figure all of this out on his trip. In fact, he didn't even realize all the finches were related but distinct species until he showed his specimens to a skilled ornithologist, bird biologist, years later. Gradually, however, he came up with an idea that could explain the pattern of related but different finches. According to Darwin's idea, this pattern would make sense if the Galapagos Islands had long ago been populated by birds from the neighboring mainland. On each island, the finches might have gradually adapted to local conditions over many generations and long periods of time. This process could have led to the formation of one or more distinct species on each island. If this idea was correct, though, why was it correct? What mechanism could explain how each finch population had acquired adaptations or features that made it well suited to its immediate environment? During his voyage and years later, Darwin developed and refined a set of his ideas that could explain the patterns he had observed during his voyage. In this book, On the Origin of Species, Darwin outlined his two key ideas, evolution and natural selection. Evolution. Darwin proposed that species can change over time, that new species come from pre-existing species, and that all species share a common ancestor. In this model, each species has its own unique set of heritable genetic differences from the common ancestor, which have accumulated gradually over very long time periods. Repeated branching events in which new species split off from a common ancestor produce a multi-level tree that links all living organisms. Here's the picture of a modern-day species appear at the top of the chart, while the ancestor from which they arose are shown lower in the chart. Image credited by Darwin's Tree of Life by Charles Darwin, photographed by A. Kopianov, public domain. Darwin referred to this process, in which groups of organisms change in heritable traits over generations, as descent with modification. Today, we call it evolution. Darwin's sketch above illustrates his idea, showing how one species can branch into two over time, and how this process can repeat multiple times in a family tree of a group of related species. Natural selection. Importantly, Darwin didn't just propose that organisms evolved. If that had been the beginning and the end of his theory, he wouldn't be in as many textbooks as he is today. Instead, Darwin also proposed a mechanism for evolution, natural selection. This mechanism was elegant and logical, and explained how populations could evolve, undergo descent with modification, in such a way that they became better suited to the environments over time. Darwin's concept of natural selection was based on several key observations. Number one, traits are often heritable. In living organisms, many characteristics are inherited or passed from parent to offspring. Darwin knew this was the case, even though he did not know that traits were inherited via genes. Parents pass on heritable traits to their offspring, like in this picture illustrated. More offspring are produced than can survive. Organisms are capable of producing more offspring than their environment can support. Thus, there is competition for limited resources in each generation. Limited resources here are referred to lack of food, habitat, and mates. Not all individuals will survive and reproduce, so just few of them will survive. Offspring vary in their heritable traits. The offspring in any generation will be slightly different from one another in their traits, like color, size, shape, etc., and many of these features will be heritable. Hey, are you red? That's pretty sweet. Wow, love that blue wing color. Based on the simple observations, Darwin concluded the following. In a population, some individuals will have inherited traits that help them survive and reproduce, given the conditions of the environment, such as the predators and food sources present. The individuals with the helpful traits will leave more offspring in the next generation than their peers, since the traits make them more effective at surviving and reproducing. Because the helpful traits are inheritable, and because organisms with these traits leave more offspring, the traits would tend to become more common, present in a larger fraction of the population in the next generation. Over generations, the population will become adapted to its environment as individuals. Okay, so I think that I just read to their weight. How would that work? The individuals with the helpful traits will live more present in a larger fraction of the population in the next generation. Over generations, the population will become adapted to its environment as individuals with traits helpful in that environment have consistently greater reproductive success than their peers. Darwin's model of evolution by natural selection allowed him to explain the patterns he had seen during his travels. For instance, if the Galapagos finch species shared a common ancestor, it made sense that they would broadly resemble one another, and mainland finches who likely shared a common ancestor. If groups of finches had been isolated on separate islands for many generations, however, each group would have been exposed to a different environment in which different heritable traits might have been favored, such as different sizes and shapes of breaks for using different food sources. These factors could have led to the formation of distinct species on each island. Read more about this on this article from Khan Academy.